The morning sun peeked through the tall windows of the Jefferson County Courthouse, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Judge Richard Bennett walked through the main entrance at exactly 8:15 a.m., just like he had done every weekday for the past 15 years. His shoes made a clicking sound against the floor as he moved with purpose, nodding briefly to the security guards who knew better than to stop him for the usual checks. At 58 years old, Judge Bennett carried himself with the confidence of someone who knew his place in the world. His silver hair was always perfectly combed, his black robes pressed without a single wrinkle, and his reputation for running a strict courtroom was well known throughout the county. His secretary, Mrs. Thompson, often joked that you could set your watch by his morning routine. "Good morning, Your Honor," Mrs. Thompson called out as he passed her desk. She was already busy sorting through the day's cases, her desktop covered with manila folders. "You have a full docket today, mostly traffic violations and a few minor offenses." "Nothing I can't handle," Judge Bennett replied with a slight smile. He had dealt with thousands of such cases over the years, and most days blended into one another. "Any interesting cases I should know about?" Mrs. Thompson shuffled through her papers. "Nothing out of the ordinary, sir, though there is one stop sign violation that's been requested for a full hearing rather than just paying the ticket." Judge Bennett frowned. He disliked when people wasted the court's time challenging simple traffic violations. In his mind, if you got a ticket, you probably deserved it. "Who's the officer who wrote the ticket?" he asked, taking a sip from his morning coffee. "Officer Mike Parker," Mrs. Thompson replied, knowing the judge would recognize the name. Parker was known for being one of the most reliable officers in the department. "Parker's a good man." Judge Bennett nodded approvingly. Never known him to write an unfair ticket. He walked into his chambers, setting his briefcase down on the large mahogany desk that had been passed down through 3 generations of judges. The morning light filtered through the Venetian blinds, highlighting the numerous awards and certificates that covered his walls. Each one was perfectly aligned, just like everything else in Judge Bennett's world. He took pride in the order he maintained, both in his personal space and his courtroom. As he settled into his leather chair, he began his daily ritual of reviewing case files. The morning's docket was indeed full, but nothing he couldn't handle efficiently. He prided himself on running a tight ship, keeping his courtroom moving like a well-oiled machine. Most days, he could clear 30 cases before lunch. "Your Honor," Mrs. Thompson's voice came through the intercom. "The first cases are ready, and the courtroom is prepared." Judge Bennett stood up, adjusting his robes in the full-length mirror near his door. He straightened his tie and checked his appearance one final time. Presentation mattered in his courtroom. It was part of maintaining the dignity of the law. Walking through the private corridor that led to his courtroom, he could hear the usual morning bustle through the heavy wooden doors. The bailiff's voice carried through, instructing people to rise as he entered. This was the moment he loved most about his day, the respect, the authority, the order of it all. As he stepped onto the raised platform where his bench sat, everyone in the courtroom stood. The morning sun now streamed through the high windows, making the polished wood surfaces gleam. Judge Bennett took his seat, adjusted his microphone, and looked out at the gathering of people before him. "Be seated," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of his position. The shuffling sound of people sitting filled the room, followed by complete silence. This was his domain, his kingdom of law and order, where his word was final. Little did Judge Bennett know that this ordinary Tuesday would be different from any other day in his 15 years on the bench. As he began calling the first cases, he had no idea that his carefully ordered world was about to be shaken to its core, and that this day would change not only his perspective, but his entire approach to justice. The bailiff called out the first case number, and Judge Bennett's day began, just like any other, except that it wouldn't end like any other. The morning proceeded as usual in Judge Bennett's courtroom, with case after case being processed efficiently. The clock had just struck 10:30 a.m. when the bailiff called out, "Case number 2847, State versus Dr. Michelle Carter." Dr. Michelle Carter stood up from her seat in the third row. At 45 years old, she carried herself with quiet confidence. Her dark brown skin contrasted elegantly with her cream-colored business suit, and her natural hair was styled professionally. As she walked to the front of the courtroom, several heads turned to observe her dignified presence. "Another traffic violation," Judge Bennett muttered under his breath, barely looking up from his papers. He had already handled 12 similar cases that morning, and in his mind, this would be no different. He didn't notice the way Dr. Carter placed her leather briefcase carefully on the defendant's table, or how she arranged her documents with practiced precision. Dr. Carter, you are charged with running a stop sign at the intersection of Maple and 4th Street on September 15th. How do you plead? Judge Bennett's voice carried the same tone he had used all morning, slightly bored and mildly irritated. Not guilty, Your Honor, Dr. Carter replied, her voice clear and measured. Several people in the courtroom straightened in their seats, noting the unusual combination of her title and presence in traffic court. Officer Parker, who had written the ticket, stood at the prosecutor's table. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Dr. Carter and his notes. Something about her composed demeanor made him second-guess his memory of that day. Officer Parker, please present your evidence, Judge Bennett commanded, still not making eye contact with Dr. Carter. The officer cleared his throat. Yes, Your Honor. On the morning in question, at approximately 8:45 a.m., I observed Dr. Carter's vehicle approaching the stop sign at Maple and 4th. In my judgment, the vehicle did not come to a complete stop before proceeding through the intersection. Dr. Carter raised her hand politely. Your Honor, may I present my evidence? Judge Bennett waved his hand dismissively. Go ahead, then make it quick. We have a full docket today. Opening her briefcase, Dr. Carter removed several documents and a small USB drive. I have here the dashcam footage from my vehicle, Your Honor. I installed it last year for precisely these types of situations. Additionally, I have printed screenshots showing my vehicle coming to a complete stop. For the first time that morning, Judge Bennett looked directly at Dr. Carter. His eyebrows raised slightly at her preparedness, but his expression remained stern. Bailiff, please set up the video evidence. As they waited for the technical setup, Dr. Carter continued. I would also like to point out that the stop sign in question was partially obscured by an overgrown tree branch. I have photographs documenting this as well, which I've already submitted to the city's maintenance department. The courtroom had grown unusually quiet. Regular attendees, lawyers, clerks, and other defendants could sense that this case was different. The typical rushed atmosphere of traffic court had shifted to something more focused. Officer Parker watched the video evidence with growing concern. The footage clearly showed Dr. Carter's car coming to a complete stop, though the angle was slightly different from his viewing position that morning. Your Honor, Dr. Carter spoke again, her voice remaining professional and calm. I understand the importance of traffic laws and their enforcement. As someone who has spent considerable time studying and working within our legal system, I take these matters very seriously. Judge Bennett's jaw tightened at her words. There was something about her manner that irritated him. Perhaps it was her excessive preparation for a simple traffic violation, or maybe it was the way she spoke about the legal system as if she had any real understanding of it. Little did he know that Dr. Carter's understanding of the legal system went far beyond what he could imagine. As she stood there, waiting for his response to the evidence, she was mentally documenting every aspect of the proceedings, from his dismissive attitude to his minimal eye contact. The courtroom remained silent, waiting for Judge Bennett's next move. The morning sun had shifted, casting shadows across his bench, as one of the most unexpected cases of his career continued to unfold before him. Judge Bennett leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming impatiently on his desk as he watched the dashcam footage for the second time. The video quality was crystal clear, almost too clear for his liking. You could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom focused on the large screen, waiting for his response. Dr. Carter, he began, his voice carrying a hint of annoyance. While your video evidence is interesting, it doesn't change the fact that Officer Parker, a decorated member of our police force, observed your vehicle from a different angle. Dr. Carter opened her mouth to speak, but Judge Bennett held up his hand, cutting her off before she could utter a word. The gesture made several people in the courtroom shift uncomfortably in their seats. Mrs. Thompson, his longtime secretary, looked down at her notepad, trying to hide her frown. Furthermore, Judge Bennett continued, his voice growing louder, I find it rather excessive that you've come to this court so prepared for a simple traffic violation. This isn't a murder trial, Dr. Carter. This is a simple matter of accepting responsibility for a minor infraction. The temperature in the room seemed to drop a few degrees. The court reporter's fingers hesitated over her keyboard for a moment before continuing to type. Officer Parker, still standing at his position, looked increasingly uncomfortable with each passing moment. "Your Honor," Dr. Carter spoke carefully, maintaining her composure, "I respectfully request permission to present my full defense, as is my right under." "Dr. Carter," Judge Bennett interrupted again, emphasizing her title with a slight mocking tone, "this court has already been more than accommodating. We've watched your video, reviewed your photographs, and heard your explanation. I have other cases waiting." A young law clerk sitting in the back row was frantically taking notes, his pen moving across his pad so quickly it looked like it might tear through the paper. He had never seen Judge Bennett behave quite like this before, especially with such clear evidence in the defendant's favor. Dr. Carter stood straight, her shoulders back, dignity intact despite the judge's dismissive treatment. She pulled out another document from her briefcase, her movements deliberate and calm. "Your Honor, I would like to submit one more piece of evidence for the record." Judge Bennett's face reddened slightly. "Dr. Carter, I've had enough of your attempts to turn this simple traffic court into some sort of theatrical performance. This isn't a classroom where you can show off your preparations." The bailiff, who had worked with Judge Bennett for over a decade, glanced nervously between the judge and Dr. Carter. He had never seen the judge this agitated over a traffic case before, and something about Dr. Carter's calm demeanor in the face of such treatment made him think there was more to this situation than met the eye. A few rows back, a young woman who had been waiting for her own case whispered to her friend, "Is he always like this?" The friend shook her head slowly, eyes wide as they watched the scene unfold. "Your Honor," Dr. Carter tried one more time, her voice steady despite the tension in the room, "I believe it's important for the court to have all relevant information before making its decision." Judge Bennett's hand came down hard on his desk, making several people jump. "Dr. Carter, this court has been more than patient. Your constant interruptions and attempts to prolong these proceedings are beginning to border on contempt." The threat of contempt charges hung heavy in the air. Mrs. Thompson had stopped pretending to take notes and was now watching the proceedings with undisguised concern. She had known Judge Bennett for years, had seen him handle thousands of cases, but something about this one was different. She could see it in the way his jaw clenched, in the unusual edge to his voice. Dr. Carter remained perfectly still, her expression unchanged despite the judge's outburst. She carefully placed the document she had been holding back into her briefcase, but kept the briefcase open. Her calm in the face of his growing anger seemed to irritate Judge Bennett even more. The morning sun had now reached its peak, streaming through the high courthouse windows and illuminating the tension-filled scene below. No one in the courtroom could have guessed that in just a few moments, everything was about to change dramatically. The tension in courtroom 3 had reached its peak as Judge Bennett shuffled through his papers, making a show of reviewing Officer Parker's report one final time. The morning had stretched into early afternoon, and what should have been a simple traffic case had turned into something far more significant. After reviewing all the evidence presented, Judge Bennett began, emphasizing the word "all" with clear sarcasm. "This court is ready to make its ruling." He paused, looking down at Dr. Carter over his reading glasses. Dr. Carter stood perfectly still, her hands folded in front of her. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Even the usual shuffling of papers and quiet whispers had ceased completely. "Dr. Carter, while you've certainly put on quite a show today with your video evidence and photographs, the fact remains that a trusted officer of the law witnessed you violating a traffic regulation." Judge Bennett's voice carried through the silent courtroom. "This court cannot allow individuals to waste valuable time trying to avoid responsibility for their actions, no matter how educated they might be." Mrs. Thompson, sitting at her desk near the judge's bench, closed her eyes briefly. In 15 years, she had never seen Judge Bennett issue such a harsh ruling in a simple traffic case. She began making careful notes of everything being said, something telling her these words would be important later. Therefore, Judge Bennett continued, satisfaction creeping into his voice, "I am finding you guilty of running a stop sign. Furthermore, due to your waste of this court's valuable time and your continued disrespect for these proceedings, I am imposing the maximum fine of $500 plus court costs." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Even Officer Parker's eyes widened in surprise. Just that morning, Judge Bennett had fined another driver only $50 for the same offense, and that driver had admitted guilt. Dr. Carter didn't flinch at the ruling. Instead, she opened her briefcase once more and removed a single business card. "Thank you, Your Honor. For the record, I would like to submit my credentials to the court clerk." Judge Bennett waved his hand dismissively. "That won't be necessary, Dr. Carter. This case is closed. You can pay your fine at the clerk's office on your way out." "I insist, Your Honor," Dr. Carter replied firmly, her voice carrying a new note of authority that made several people in the courtroom sit up straighter. "It's important for the court records to be complete." The clerk, a young woman named Sarah, walked over to accept Dr. Carter's card. As she read it, her face paled visibly. Her hands shaking slightly, she walked the card up to Judge Bennett's bench. "Your Honor," Sarah whispered, "you might want to see this." Judge Bennett took the card with obvious annoyance, but as his eyes scanned the text, the color drained from his face. He read it again, then a third time, as if hoping the words would somehow change. The card was elegant in its simplicity. Dr. Michelle Carter, PhD, JD, Director of State Judicial Review Board. Below the title was a state seal and contact information for the department that oversaw all judicial conduct in the state. For the first time that day, Judge Bennett found himself speechless. He looked up at Dr. Carter, seeing her properly for the first time. Gone was his dismissive attitude, replaced by a dawning realization of what had just transpired. Dr. Carter gathered her materials calmly, placing them back in her briefcase with precise movements. The courtroom remained deadly silent, though a few people in the gallery had begun to understand that something significant had just happened. "This has been a most informative morning, Your Honor." Dr. Carter spoke clearly, her words carrying to every corner of the hushed courtroom. "I look forward to reviewing today's proceedings in detail with my colleagues at the State Judicial Review Board." Judge Bennett's hands, still holding her business card, trembled slightly. The power dynamic in his courtroom had shifted dramatically, and everyone present could feel it. His kingdom of absolute authority had just crumbled around him in the space of 30 seconds. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtroom floor, marking the end of one of the most remarkable traffic court sessions in the county's history. But for Judge Bennett and Dr. Carter, this was only the beginning. The news spread through the courthouse like wildfire. By the time Dr. Carter reached the main hallway, whispers followed in her wake. Court officers, lawyers, and clerks who had witnessed the scene in traffic court were already sharing the story with their colleagues in hushed, excited tones. Meanwhile, Judge Bennett sat alone in his chambers, Dr. Carter's business card still lying on his desk like a live grenade. His hands shook slightly as he reached for his phone, then pulled back. Who could he even call? What could he say? The gravity of his actions was sinking in with each passing minute. Mrs. Thompson knocked softly before entering his office. In 15 years, she had never seen Judge Bennett look so shaken. His usual confident posture was gone, replaced by slumped shoulders and a pale complexion. "Your Honor," she began gently, "the afternoon docket." "Cancel it," he interrupted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Cancel everything for the rest of the day." Mrs. Thompson nodded, having already anticipated this request. "I've taken the liberty of rescheduling your cases." She paused, then added, "Judge, perhaps you should know. Dr. Carter stayed in the building. She's currently meeting with Chief Judge Harrison in his office." The news hit Judge Bennett like a physical blow. Chief Judge Harrison was his direct superior and a close friend of 20 years. The thought of Dr. Carter sharing the morning's events with him made Bennett's stomach turn. In the Chief Judge's office, 6 floors above, Dr. Carter sat comfortably in a leather chair, her briefcase open on her lap. Chief Judge Harrison, a man in his 60s with kind eyes and gray hair, listened intently as she played the audio recording from her phone. "I make it a habit to record all my interactions with the justice system," Dr. Carter explained, her voice professional but firm. "As you can hear, Judge Bennett's conduct was concerning." Chief Judge Harrison removed his glasses and rubbed his temples. "Dr. Carter, I want to personally apologize for what happened in that courtroom today. This is not representative of how we—" "Chief Judge Harrison," Dr. Carter interrupted politely, "this isn't about one incident. My office has been monitoring Pattern 3 complaints across the state for the past 6 months. Pattern 3 refers to disparate treatment based on race, gender, or socioeconomic status." She pulled out a thick folder from her briefcase. This contains transcripts from Judge Bennett's courtroom over the last 3 months. The data shows a disturbing pattern in his sentencing and behavior, particularly towards minorities and women. The chief judge's face grew more serious as he flipped through the documents. Statistics, transcripts, and detailed analyses painted a picture he couldn't ignore. "I had no idea," he murmured, more to himself than to Dr. Carter. Back in his chambers, Judge Bennett finally gathered the courage to look at his own court records. With trembling hands, he pulled up case after case on his computer. As he reviewed his recent rulings, patterns he had never noticed, or perhaps had chosen not to notice, became glaringly obvious. White defendants receiving minimum fines while minorities received harsher penalties for identical offenses. Women's testimonies being interrupted far more frequently than men's. Dismissive comments he had made, thinking they were harmless at the time, now read back like damning evidence of his bias. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across his desk as he continued his self-examination. A knock at his door made him jump. It was his bailiff, looking uncomfortable. "Judge Bennett, Chief Judge Harrison would like to see you in his office, immediately." As Bennett stood to leave his chambers, he caught his reflection in the window. For the first time in his career, he didn't see a respected judge staring back at him. Instead, he saw someone who had allowed power and prejudice to corrupt the very principles of justice he had sworn to uphold. The walk to the chief judge's office felt like the longest of his life. Each step echoed in the quiet hallway, matching the heavy beating of his heart. He knew that whatever happened next would change his career forever, and he had no one to blame but himself. 1 week after the traffic court incident, Judge Bennett sat nervously in the waiting area of the State Judicial Review Board's office. The modern building, with its glass walls and sleek furniture, felt nothing like his comfortable courthouse. Here, he had no authority, no power. He was simply another person awaiting judgment. The receptionist, a young man with a kind smile, looked up from his computer. "Dr. Carter will see you now, Judge Bennett." The way he said "Judge" made Bennett wonder if he'd heard about the incident. By now, he assumed everyone had. Dr. Carter's office was spacious but not showy. Large windows overlooked the city, and the walls were lined with law books and framed degrees from prestigious universities. She stood as he entered, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. "Thank you for coming, Judge Bennett," she said professionally, her voice neither angry nor sympathetic. She picked up a thick folder from her desk, the same one he had seen her carrying in his courtroom a week ago. "I've spent the past week reviewing your cases from the last 3 years," she began, opening the folder. "Would you like to know what I found?" Bennett's throat felt dry. "Yes, ma'am," he managed to say, the formal address feeling strange on his tongue. Dr. Carter pressed a button on her desk, and a large screen on the wall came to life with charts and statistics. "In cases involving traffic violations, you imposed fines averaging 70% higher for minorities compared to white defendants. In cases involving female defendants, you interrupted their testimony an average of 12 times per session, compared to 3 times for male defendants." She clicked to the next slide. "Your dismissal rate for cases involving minority defendants challenging their tickets is 92%, while for white defendants, it's 47%. Each number felt like a physical blow to Bennett's chest. I had no idea," he whispered, but even as he said it, he knew it wasn't entirely true. He had simply chosen not to see it. "That's part of the problem, Judge Bennett," Dr. Carter replied, her voice firm but not unkind. "Bias often operates below our conscious awareness, but as judges, we have a responsibility to examine our decisions and their impacts carefully." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. "I could recommend your immediate removal from the bench. The evidence would certainly support it." Bennett felt his heart stop for a moment. "However, I believe that would be a waste of an opportunity." Turning back to face him, Dr. Carter continued, "Instead, I'm implementing a new training program. You'll be one of its first participants. It's intensive, 6 months of bias training, cultural competency workshops, and supervised courtroom sessions." Bennett blinked in surprise. This wasn't what he had expected. "You're giving me a chance to change?" "I'm giving the justice system a chance to improve," Dr. Carter corrected him. "You're simply the starting point. Your case will be an anonymous example in future judicial training sessions. Your data will help other judges recognize their own biases. She returned to her desk and pulled out another document. This is a voluntary agreement. You'll attend all training sessions, submit to regular reviews, and mentor other judges once you've completed the program. Or you can choose to resign immediately. The choice is yours. Bennett stared at the document, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for it. Why? He asked quietly. Why offer me this chance after how I treated you? Dr. Carter's expression softened slightly. Because true justice isn't about punishment, Judge Bennett. It's about growth and transformation. What happened in your courtroom last week wasn't just about you or me. It's about a system that needs to change. She handed him a pen. The question is, are you willing to be part of that change? Bennett looked at the document, then at Dr. Carter. For the first time, he saw her not as a defendant or a superior, but as someone offering him a path to becoming a better person and a better judge. With a steady hand, he signed the agreement. As he did, sunlight broke through the clouds outside, filling the office with warm light. A fitting symbol for what felt like a new beginning. 3 months into his training program, Judge Bennett sat in the back of a large conference room, listening intently to a speaker discuss implicit bias in the justice system. Gone was his usual judicial robe. Instead, he wore a simple blue suit and sat among other judges and court officials who were part of the mandatory training program. The speaker, a respected civil rights attorney, clicked to a new slide showing statistics about racial disparities in sentencing. Bennett found himself nodding along, recognizing patterns he had once been blind to. He glanced down at his notebook, already filled with 3 pages of careful notes from just this morning's session. Judge Bennett, the speaker called out, making him look up suddenly. Would you be willing to share your perspective on how unconscious bias might affect even the most well-intentioned judges? 6 months ago, such a question would have made him defensive. Now, he stood up slowly, looking around at his colleagues. Of course, he began, his voice humble but clear. I used to believe that putting on these robes made us completely objective. I was wrong. The room grew quiet as he continued. Last month, I reviewed recordings of my own court sessions from the past year. I watched myself interrupt women more frequently than men. I saw myself use a harsher tone with minorities. These weren't conscious decisions. I didn't even realize I was doing it, but the evidence was right there. In the doorway, unseen by the other participants, Dr. Carter stood quietly, listening. She had been monitoring Bennett's progress throughout the program, and this moment of honest self-reflection brought a small smile to her face. During the lunch break, Bennett sat alone in the courthouse cafeteria, reviewing his morning notes. A young black female judge, recently appointed to the family court, approached his table. May I join you? She asked. Bennett looked up, quickly gesturing to the empty chair. I heard what you said this morning, she continued. It couldn't have been easy to admit those things in front of everyone. Bennett put down his fork. Nothing about this process has been easy, he admitted. But necessary things rarely are. He paused, then added, I've been on the bench for 15 years, but I feel like I'm just now learning how to be a real judge. As they talked, other judges began joining their table. Soon, what had started as a quiet lunch turned into an impromptu discussion group. Bennett found himself sharing stories of his previous misconceptions and the lessons he'd learned. Last week, he told the group, I had a case similar to one I'd handled a year ago. Same offense, similar circumstances. But this time, I caught myself making assumptions about the defendant. I stopped, took a moment, and made sure my decision was based solely on the evidence. One of the older judges nodded. We all need to do better, he said. But how did you start noticing these things? Bennett thought about it. It began with one case, he said carefully, not mentioning Dr. Carter by name. Sometimes it takes a mirror being held up to your face to see what others have been seeing all along. Later that afternoon, during a break in the training, Bennett walked past his old courtroom. Through the window in the door, he could see another judge presiding, one of several who had been handling his cases while he completed the program. The scene looked different from this side of the bench. His phone buzzed with a message. It was from Dr. Carter. Progress report meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m. Bring your reflection journal. Bennett touched his pocket where he kept the small notebook he'd been using to document his journey. Each entry represented a step away from who he had been and toward who he was trying to become. Some days were harder than others, but he hadn't missed a single entry. As he walked back to the training session, he passed a wall of judicial portraits, generations of judges who had served in this courthouse. His own portrait hung among them, taken years ago when he first assumed the bench. The man in that picture looked foreign to him now, so sure of himself, so unaware of his own biases. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons, and new opportunities to prove that people could change. But for now, he had more notes to take, more learning to do, and more growth ahead of him. 6 months after the traffic court incident, Judge Bennett stood in front of the State Judicial Review Board, presenting his final assessment. The room was filled with senior judges, court administrators, and legal professionals, including Dr. Carter, who sat quietly observing from the center of the panel. "When I started this journey," Bennett began, his voice steady but humble, "I thought I knew what justice meant. I had memorized every law, every procedure, but I had missed something far more important, the human element." He clicked to the next slide of his presentation, showing his courtroom statistics from before and after the training program. The contrast was striking. The racial and gender disparities in his rulings had dropped significantly, and his courtroom satisfaction ratings had improved by over 70%. "But numbers don't tell the whole story," he continued, looking directly at his audience. "Last week, a young woman appeared in my court for a speeding ticket. 6 months ago, I wouldn't have let her finish her explanation. This time, I listened. Turned out she was rushing her sick child to the hospital. The old Judge Bennett would have missed that completely." Dr. Carter nodded slightly, making a note in her folder. She had been monitoring his progress closely, and the transformation she witnessed went beyond what she had initially hoped for. After his presentation, the board went into private deliberations. Bennett waited in the hallway, remembering how different this building had felt 6 months ago when he first arrived for training. Now, the marble floors and high ceilings no longer intimidated him. Finally, they called him back in. Chief Justice Williams, the head of the review board, stood to deliver their decision. "Judge Bennett," he began, "your progress over these past 6 months has been remarkable. Not only have you shown significant improvement in your courtroom conduct, but you've also become an advocate for change within our judicial system." The Chief Justice picked up a document from his desk. "Therefore, we are not only reinstating you to full judicial duties but also appointing you as the first instructor in our new Judicial Bias Awareness Program. Your experience and transformation will serve as a model for other judges across the state." Bennett felt a wave of emotion wash over him. This wasn't just a reinstatement. It was an opportunity to help create real change in the system. After the meeting, as people filed out of the room, Dr. Carter approached him. "Congratulations, Judge Bennett," she said, extending her hand. "Though I suspect the real congratulations belong to the future defendants in your courtroom." Bennett shook her hand, remembering their first encounter in traffic court. "Dr. Carter, I never properly thanked you. You could have ended my career that day, but instead, you chose to help me become better." She smiled. "Sometimes the best way to change a system is to transform it from within. Your story will help other judges recognize and address their own biases." The following Monday, Bennett returned to his courtroom. The familiar space felt different now, not because it had changed, but because he had. As he adjusted his robes, Mrs. Thompson poked her head in. "Your Honor, your first case is ready," she said, smiling warmly. "It's good to have you back." Before stepping out, Bennett looked at a new addition to his chambers, a small mirror he had installed next to his door. It served as a daily reminder to check not just his appearance, but his prejudices and assumptions before entering the courtroom. As he took his seat at the bench, the bailiff called out, "All rise." The people in the courtroom stood, just as they had hundreds of times before. But this time, as Bennett looked out at the faces before him, different races, genders, and backgrounds, he saw them differently. He saw them as people first, each with their own story, each deserving of true justice. "Be seated," he said, his voice carrying the weight not of authority, but of responsibility. As he opened the first case file, he smiled slightly, remembering Dr. Carter's words from months ago. True justice isn't about punishment, it's about growth and transformation. And in that moment, Judge Richard Bennett knew that while his own transformation was significant, it was just the beginning of a much larger change in the system he had sworn to serve.